A young couple, Emily and Ryan, decided to escape the bustle of city life with a weekend trip to a remote cabin they found on Airbnb. Nestled deep in the woods, the listing boasted serenity, stunning views, and the perfect place to disconnect. The host reviews were glowing, and the price was a steal. The pictures showed a charming, rustic cabin with a cozy interior and a wraparound porch overlooking the forest. It seemed too good to pass up. When they arrived, the sun was setting, casting an amber glow over the secluded property. The cabin looked exactly as advertised, quaint and inviting. The host had left a handwritten note on the table welcoming them, along with a bottle of wine and some snacks. Yet, something felt slightly off. The air inside was heavy, almost oppressive, and Emily noticed faint scratches on the doorframe as they carried in their bags. She chalked it up to wildlife and pushed the thought aside. That first night, as they settled into bed, the sounds of the forest enveloped them, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But around 2 a.m., Emily awoke to a peculiar noise. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but it grew louder. It was coming from the window. She froze, staring at the silhouette of tree branches swaying in the moonlight. Ryan stirred beside her and mumbled something about it being the wind. Still, unease crept over her. The next morning, Emily noticed something strange. The curtains in the living room, which she distinctly remembered closing the night before, were now open. She mentioned it to Ryan, but he shrugged it off, teasing her about overthinking. They spent the day hiking and exploring, returning just before dusk to cook dinner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin seemed to take on a life of its own. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the creaking floorboards seemed to follow them. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just at the window. It came from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. It was as though something or someone was trying to get in. Emily grabbed Ryan's arm, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, his expression now matching her fear. Grabbing a flashlight, Ryan decided to investigate. Emily followed close behind, her heart pounding. They checked every corner of the cabin, but found nothing. Just as they were about to head back to bed, they heard a low, guttural laugh from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Ryan shone the flashlight through the window, but the beam revealed only darkness and swaying trees. Sleep was impossible. They stayed awake, jumping at every sound until the first light of dawn. Determined to leave, they packed their bags quickly. But as they stepped outside, their blood ran cold. Around the cabin, in a perfect circle, were dozens of footprints in the dirt. They weren't barefoot, nor did they resemble any shoe pattern. They were elongated and inhuman. Panicked, they rushed to the car. As they sped away, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror and screamed. Standing on the porch was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette that waved slowly as they disappeared down the winding path. Later, when they tried to contact the host, the Airbnb listing had vanished. No trace of the property existed online. They even scoured maps, but the cabin seemed to have never been there. To this day, Emily and Ryan don't know what they encountered that weekend, but they're certain of one thing: they'll never rent a remote Airbnb again.
Story number 2.
A group of 4 college friends, Sophie, Marcus, Ben, and Kayla, were looking for an affordable Airbnb for a weekend getaway. They came across a listing for a sprawling Victorian house in a small, rural town. The photos showcased ornate wooden staircases, vintage furniture, and a garden overgrown with wildflowers. The price was unbelievably low, but the host's bio mentioned it being their late grandmother's house, now unused. The friends booked it without hesitation, excited for a unique and peaceful retreat. When they arrived, the house was larger than it looked in the pictures, its towering frame casting long shadows under the cloudy sky. The host, a middle-aged man with a distant smile, handed them the keys. "Stay out of the basement," he said firmly before leaving, offering no explanation. The house was eerily silent as they stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the dim light, filtering through heavy curtains. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. The friends explored the house, marveling at its antique charm, but Sophie noticed small details that made her uneasy. Deep scratches on the floorboards near the stairs, locks on the outside of bedroom doors, and a cracked mirror in the upstairs hallway. As the first night fell, the mood shifted. The friends gathered in the living room, laughing and sharing ghost stories. But their laughter faded when the house itself seemed to join the conversation. Soft creaks turned into heavy footsteps coming from the floor above. Marcus, trying to lighten the mood, joked, "It's probably the house settling. Old houses do that, right?" But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, pacing back and forth. "It's probably an animal," Ben offered, though his voice was shaky. Sophie wasn't convinced. Determined to prove there was nothing to fear, Marcus and Ben went upstairs to investigate. They found nothing unusual, but as they were heading back down, the door to one of the bedrooms slammed shut behind them. Startled, they yanked it open to find the room empty. Yet the temperature had dropped significantly, and the mirror on the wall was fogged up, as though someone had just breathed on it. That night, they all slept in the living room, too scared to stay in separate rooms. Around 3 a.m., Sophie woke to the sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was Kayla, but when she looked around, everyone was asleep. The whispers were faint and seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement door. Against her better judgment, Sophie crept closer. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a pitch-black staircase. She froze when the whispers stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate creak as if something was climbing the stairs. Sophie ran back to wake the others. As they huddled together, they heard it too, the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps ascending the basement stairs. Suddenly, the living room lights flickered and the air grew suffocating. The basement door swung open violently, slamming into the wall. In the doorway stood a figure, shrouded in darkness, its shape barely human. Its head tilted unnaturally as it emitted a low, guttural growl. Kayla screamed, snapping everyone out of their paralysis. They bolted out of the house, not stopping until they reached their car. The next morning, they tried contacting the host to demand answers, but his profile had been deleted. When they reported the incident to Airbnb, they were told no such property had ever been listed in that area. Months later, Sophie came across a news article about the house. It had been abandoned for decades after a string of disappearances. The final owner, the host's grandmother, was rumored to have practiced dark rituals in the basement before vanishing without a trace. The friends never spoke of the trip again, but Sophie still wakes at night to hear faint whispers, as if something followed her home.
Story number 3.
A seasoned traveler named Claire was used to solo trips and always scoured Airbnb for unique stays. When she stumbled upon a charming rustic farmhouse listed as the perfect escape, she was intrigued. The photos showcased a quaint home surrounded by lush fields with a small pond glistening under the sun. The reviews were minimal but positive, describing the host as helpful but unobtrusive. It seemed like the solitude Claire craved, so she booked it for a long weekend. The directions led her deep into the countryside, far from any sign of civilization. By the time she arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The farmhouse looked just as it had in the pictures, though the surrounding fields seemed wild and unkempt, as if they'd been untouched for years. The host, a wiry man with an unnervingly toothy smile, handed her the keys without much conversation. He mentioned he lived nearby if she needed anything, then disappeared down the dirt road. Inside, the house was cozy but old. Dust lingered in the air, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. Claire set her bags down and explored the rooms. Most were as expected, though one door at the end of the hallway was locked. She assumed it was a storage room and thought nothing of it. That night, the isolation felt heavier than she anticipated. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. No sounds of crickets or rustling leaves, just an unnerving stillness. As she settled into bed, she heard a faint tapping sound. It wasn't coming from outside, but from within the house. Claire froze, straining her ears. The sound moved, first near the kitchen, then toward the hallway. Gripping her phone, she crept out of bed and turned on the flashlight. She searched every room but found nothing. Shaking her head, she told herself it was the house settling and went back to bed. The second night, things escalated. Around midnight, she woke to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps echoed from the floor above. The problem was, the farmhouse was only one story. Claire's stomach churned as she realized the sound was coming from the roof. Summoning her courage, she peeked out the window. In the moonlight, she saw a dark figure perched on the edge of the roof, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring directly at her window. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. When she looked again, the figure was gone. Desperate to leave, she began packing her belongings. But as she zipped her bag, a chilling sound stopped her. The locked door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Claire stared in disbelief. She knew she hadn't touched it. Peering down the hallway, she saw the door slowly swinging inward, revealing pitch darkness. A guttural growl emanated from within, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. Claire bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been bolted shut from the outside. Panic surged as she heard the footsteps getting closer. She ran to the window, throwing it open and climbing out into the cold night. As she sprinted toward her car, she glanced back. Standing in the doorway was the figure from the roof, its hollow eyes glinting in the moonlight. Claire didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town, where she collapsed in a diner and begged the staff to call the police. When authorities went to investigate the farmhouse, they found it abandoned and dilapidated, with no signs of recent habitation. The Airbnb listing had vanished, along with any trace of the host. Weeks later, Claire received a notification from Airbnb, a review left on her account. It was from the farmhouse listing. The comment simply read, "You left too soon. Come back, we're waiting."
Story number 4.
A young couple, Lily and James, decided to celebrate their anniversary with a quiet weekend away. They found a listing for a historic stone cottage nestled in a remote mountain valley. The description called it a timeless retreat, and the photos showed a charming home surrounded by misty woods. The reviews mentioned its old-world charm and solitude, but were oddly vague about the overall experience. Still, the price was reasonable, and the idea of complete seclusion appealed to them. When they arrived, the cottage looked even older than in the pictures, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a crooked chimney leaning slightly to one side. The host wasn't there to greet them, but the key was left in a rusted lockbox by the door. A handwritten note inside read, "Enjoy your stay. The forest is alive. Listen carefully." Lily thought it was an odd but poetic welcome. Inside, the cottage was rustic and dimly lit, with heavy beams overhead and furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. The fireplace was massive, its hearth blackened with soot. There was no Wi-Fi or cell service, but they had come to disconnect, so they didn't mind. They unpacked and settled in, lighting candles to add warmth to the shadowy rooms. The first evening passed uneventfully, though Lily felt uneasy. The woods surrounding the cottage seemed unnervingly quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. When she mentioned it to James, he shrugged it off, teasing her for being too urbanized. That night, as they lay in bed, Lily was awakened by a faint sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she realized it was rhythmic, a slow, deliberate scratching. It seemed to be coming from the walls. She nudged James awake, who groggily dismissed it as mice or the house settling. But the sound persisted, growing louder. When James finally got up to investigate, the scratching stopped abruptly. They searched the cottage but found no signs of animals. Just as they were returning to bed, there was a loud thump against the front door. James froze, gripping the fireplace poker for protection, while Lily clung to his arm. He cracked the door open, but no one was there, only the dense, impenetrable darkness of the forest. The next day, the couple went hiking, hoping to shake off the tension from the previous night. As they walked deeper into the woods, they noticed odd things: twisted branches that formed unnatural shapes, deep gouges in tree trunks, and piles of stones arranged in strange patterns. James tried to laugh it off as someone's idea of a prank, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, as they prepared dinner, the atmosphere in the cottage felt heavier. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the fireplace, despite being unlit, exuded a faint, acrid smell. Around midnight, the scratching returned, this time louder and accompanied by faint whispers. Lily pressed her ear to the wall, trying to make sense of the whispers. It was then she realized they weren't coming from outside, but from within the walls. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling, "there's something inside." Before he could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the darkened room. Shapes began to emerge in the faint candlelight, shadowy figures standing just beyond the reach of the flames' glow. Terrified, they grabbed their bags and made a run for the car. As they stumbled out the door, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Dozens of figures stood silently at the tree line, their faces obscured, but their heads tilting unnaturally as they watched the couple. The car wouldn't start at first, and Lily was on the verge of tears as James frantically turned the key. Finally, the engine roared to life, and they sped away. In the rearview mirror, Lily saw the figures slowly retreat into the woods, disappearing as if they had never been there. The next morning, James called the Airbnb host to demand an explanation. The host's voice was calm but eerily flat. "You left early," he said. "Not many do. They usually stay forever." When James tried to report the listing to Airbnb, it was gone, as if the cottage had never existed. To this day, Lily refuses to step foot in the woods, and James has nightmares of shadowy figures standing at the edge of their bed, waiting.